My name is Vanessa Cole. I'm 35 years old, and I keep dyeing reefs alive for a living. Last April, at my parents' dinner table, my family announced my sister's fourth baby. And then, in the same breath, over the same green bean casserole, they announced what they'd decided to do with the next 2 years of my life. My mother said it with a smile, the kind she saves for church photos. "You don't really have a life to interrupt, do you, sweetheart?" Everyone kept passing the rolls like my future was just another side dish somebody had already served. None of them knew about the folder sitting on my laptop, 3 weeks from changing everything, and what my mother said after I finally showed them as the part 1 still here at night, because the laptop wasn't the ending. It was only the match. Welcome to Hidden Chapters, where the quiet ones finally get their say. If you've ever been the one everybody leans on and nobody actually sees, this one's for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and hit subscribe, because the ending of this story is worth staying for. Let me take you back to a Sunday about 4 months before that dinner, so you understand exactly what my family thought I was for. Sundays at my parents' house on Birch Lake went like this. I'd drive the 40 minutes from my apartment near the marine lab with a casserole dish riding shotgun, because my mother had called Thursday and said, "You'll bring the corn thing, you're so good at it." I'd peel potatoes at the sink while my sister Renee put her feet up on the ottoman, 3 kids deep and pregnant with a 4th, exhausted in the way that earns real sympathy from everyone in that house except, somehow, from itself toward me. I'd wipe sticky handprints off the sliding door. I'd change a smoke detector battery my father had mentioned twice without looking at me, which in Cole family language is a formal work order. I'd keep half an eye on Jonah, who was 6, and Piper, who was 3, while their parents scrolled their phones on the porch, and my mother gave my aunt friend the full tour of my brother-in-law Chris's new promotion at the marina. Chris got a toast that Sunday. Renee got sympathy for her exhaustion. I got asked whether I'd ever get around to looking at the leaky gutter over the garage. I want to be clear, I wasn't sulking in a corner. I laughed at the jokes. I cut the pie. I love those kids so much it embarrasses me sometimes. But somewhere between the dishes and the diaper I ended up changing without being asked. I understood my role in that house the way you understand weather. I was the appliance. Reliable, plugged in, never consulted. That particular Sunday, we were clearing plates when my mother looked around and asked if anyone had seen the gravy boat lid, and 4 adults turned to me at the same exact moment, like I was the family's lost and found. My mother packed leftovers on the way out, for Renee's family, for Aunt Fran, for the neighbor. There was no plate packed for me. Nobody had noticed I hadn't actually sat down to eat. I noticed, though. I always noticed. If you want to understand how I got assigned that role in the first place, you have to meet my grandfather, Walt Sr. When I was 26, his heart started failing, slow and mean, the way hearts sometimes do, and the family held a meeting at my parents' kitchen table that lasted about 11 minutes. Renee had 2 babies and a mortgage by then. My mother said her hip was bad. My father said whatever my mother said. And then every face at that table turned to me with the same warm, terrible confidence, and my mother said the sentence that would quietly run my life for the next 4 years. "You've got the flexible schedule, Vanessa. Field research, grant deadlines, you can shift things around." I did not have a flexible schedule. I had a research position at a coastal lab studying reef restoration, tide charts I didn't control, boats that left the dock at 5 a.m. whether or not my grandfather had a good night. But I became the flexible one anyway, because once a family decides what you are, correcting them starts to feel like an argument you're guaranteed to lose. For years of evenings and weekends at my grandfather's little house off County Road 9. Pill organizers, oxygen tank checks, 2 ambulance rides at 3 in the morning, 1 Christmas Eve spent in an ER hallway holding his hand while my family texted asking if I could still make the pie. I was running full field seasons at the lab and then driving 40 minutes to do a second unpaid shift most nights. My mother handled what she called logistics, which meant phone calls, which meant instructions, which meant me. My grandfather died 3 years ago at 89, my hand in his. At the funeral, the pastor stood up and praised my mother's devotion to family caregiving, and my mother dabbed her eyes and accepted it graciously. I stood in the second row in shoes my Aunt Fran had bought me for the occasion, and I learned something that day about how credit travels in my family. It flows uphill, every time, without fail. I'll tell you now, because it matters for everything that comes later, that my grandfather left me something. Not money, the little he had went into home repairs years before he died. Something else. I'll get to it, I promise, because it's the reason there was a folder on my laptop at all by the time the story really starts. After my grandfather died, the family found me a new job without ever posting the opening. Renee and Chris lived 20 minutes from the lab with 3 kids and a schedule held together with duct tape and prayer. I became the tape. Fever at midnight, call Aunt Vanessa, she's got that flexible thing. Chris stuck late at the marina, Vanessa can get Jonah from practice. Anniversary weekend, Vanessa will take all 3, she's so good with them. And here's the complicated part, the part that kept the whole machine running smoothly for years. I genuinely loved those kids. Jonah, 6, who narrated his own bike rides like a sports announcer. Piper, 3, a small blonde wrecking ball with my grandfather's exact laugh. And Lily. Lily was 8, and she was mine in some quiet way I've never been able to defend biologically. She was the only person in that entire family who ever asked me questions about me. What's the deepest you've ever dived, Aunt Nessa? Do fish get scared? What's your favorite kind of coral? I would have walked into open water for that kid, and everybody in the family knew it. That was exactly the problem. Love is a wonderful rope to tie somebody with. Because they'll hold the knot for you themselves. I had tried boundaries before, for the record. 2 years ago I told Renee no more overnight babysitting on weeknights, because I was running early morning sample collections that started before sunrise. That lasted exactly until the next stomach flu went through her house. When I held the line anyway, I didn't get an argument. I got a sigh, a long look, and my mother on the phone a few days later saying I'd gotten difficult lately, followed by 3 weeks of being lovingly punished with silence, which I eventually patched by hosting Easter. I thought by then I understood the full arithmetic of my family. I thought I knew every way they could spend me. I didn't. They were about to discover a whole new currency. Let me show you the 2 halves of my life, side by side, the way I lived them that spring. One Tuesday in February, I was 40 feet down off a research vessel, checking transplant plots on a coral nursery we'd been nursing back from a bleaching event for 3 years, watching new polyps take hold on frames my team had built with our own hands. It was the kind of dive that reminds you why you chose this work in the first place: cold water, silent focus, something dying slowly being coaxed back toward life. 12 hours later, I was at my parents' house because my mother needed help moving the good china before Easter. When I finished, I mentioned I was exhausted and wanted to head home, and my mother waved a dish towel at me, cheerful as a hymn, and said, "Oh, stay and dry the good glasses, honey, it's not like you've got anything waiting for you." I stood there with my hands in cooling gray dishwater and did the math nobody else in that kitchen ever did. Colleagues at a research conference had once called what I do groundbreaking work. The woman who raised me thought I was a free evening with legs. That's the thing about being useful. If you've lived it, you already know useful is invisible. A lamp is useful. Nobody asks the lamp about its day. I dried the glasses. I drove home and sat in my car outside my building for a long while before I went inside. 3 weeks later, the group chat exploded, and everything I'm about to tell you began. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March when my phone lit up on the lab bench like a slot machine. The Cole family group chat, 20-something messages in under 5 minutes. At the top, an ultrasound photo, gray and grainy and unmistakable, and under it my sister had typed baby number 4 with a string of exclamation points that would embarrass a teenager. Chris followed with a heart emoji. My father sent a thumbs up, which for Walter Cole Jr. is practically a sonnet. And I stood there in my field gear, salt still drying on my forearms, and I felt the real, honest thing first, before anything else. Gladness. I love those kids. I've spent 13 years learning how to bring dying things back to life, and a new niece or nephew is not a tragedy to me. I typed my congratulations with my whole heart, and I want that on the record, whatever you think of me by the end of this story. I loved that baby before anyone had measured me for a cage. I just slid my phone back into my pocket when it buzzed again. Not the group chat this time. A private call. Mom. That alone was strange, because my mother communicates almost exclusively by summons, usually delivered through whoever happens to be standing nearest her. Her voice had a shine to it I hadn't heard in years, the sound she gets around weddings and funerals, occasions where she gets to direct. Isn't it wonderful? She said, and before I could answer, she dropped her voice like we were co-conspirators. We need to talk about the plan, sweetheart. I looked at my own reflection in the lab's dark window. What plan, Mom? Nobody had invited me to any meeting with a plan attached to it. She laughed, light as sugar, and said we'd talk Sunday, and hung up before I could ask anything else. I stood there with a feeling in my stomach I couldn't yet name. My body knew before I did. Sunday came, and I found out exactly what the shine in her voice had been made of. My mother laid it out at her kitchen counter while she frosted a sheet cake, casual as a weather report. Renee would be down for the count by fall, with a newborn and 3 other kids, and daycare for that crowd cost more than Chris made in a month at the marina, which was true, and I agreed with that part, which was my first mistake, because agreement in my family is treated as a signature. Then she got to the heart of it. So we've been thinking, you could take a leave from the lab. Honestly, a proper break would probably do you good anyway. Family takes care of family. She smoothed the frosting flat with the back of a spoon. I set my coffee down and I said it plainly, calmly, the way you'd state your name in court. No, Mom. I have a career. I've spent 13 years building it. I'm not stepping away to be a full-time nanny. And here is the part one need you to sit with, because everything that follows grows directly out of this moment. My mother did not argue with me. Arguing would have meant she'd actually heard me. She just smiled at the cake, tapped the spatula twice against the bowl, and said, well, we'll sort out the details later, the way you'd brush off a small concern about parking. My father wandered in, swiped a finger of frosting, and said, your mother's got it all worked out, with real admiration, the way other men say my wife restores furniture. I drove home with my hands too tight on the wheel, replaying it. I had said no, clearly, in plain English, and it had passed through her like wind through a screen door. What scared me wasn't that she'd ignored me. It was how relaxed she'd been. My mother is never relaxed unless she's already certain she's won. I couldn't figure out where that certainty was coming from. I found out soon enough. That night, back in my apartment, I did what I'd been doing almost every night for 11 months. I opened my laptop and refreshed my email the way some people say a quiet grace before bed. Here's what nobody in my family knew. Nearly a year earlier, in June, I'd worked the worst week of my career, watching a bleaching event wipe out 18 months of restoration work in 4 days, and I'd come home to a voicemail from my mother asking me to make 3 dozen deviled eggs for a church potluck, since you're off Thursday anyway. Something in me went very still that night. Not broken. Focused. Still in my field boots, I pulled up an application I'd bookmarked over a year earlier and never let myself finish. A 2-year research fellowship with a marine institute in Tasmania, leading a kelp forest restoration program off the southeast coast, exactly the work I'd spent my whole career training toward, at a scale I'd never once had access to at home. I'd met the program director, Dr. Aoife Hensley, at a conference in San Diego, where she'd watched me present our coral nursery data and said, you think in decades, not seasons. Have you ever thought about doing this on purpose, somewhere with the funding to match it? I did 2 video interviews that autumn on my days off, blazer on top, field pants below the camera line. By March, I was one of 2 finalists. Final decisions were promised within the month. The only living soul who knew was Priya, my closest colleague at the lab, who kept my secret like a vault and asked about it in code over coffee. Any weather from the south. So while my mother frosted her certainty onto a sheet cake, I had a maybe growing on the other side of the planet. A maybe. That's all it was. But some nights, a maybe is the only thing standing between a woman and a basement bedroom. The first proof of what my mother had already set in motion arrived 10 days later, in the middle of a field day. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize, and when I stepped away from the boat to answer, a pleasant voice said, "Miss Cole, this is the front office at Birchwood Elementary. Jonah's running a fever and we couldn't reach his parents. You're listed as his emergency contact." I said, "His what?" The woman repeated it, patient as could be. "Second emergency contact, right after the parents." Renee had listed me that winter. Nobody had asked me. Nobody had even told me. It takes nothing to do that, by the way. A parent just writes a name and a number on a form. No signature required from the person being volunteered. I traded my afternoon sample run, drove to the school, and collected a pink-cheeked, miserable Jonah, got him settled at home with medicine and cartoons, because none of this was his fault. While I was hanging his backpack on its hook, a folded sheet of paper slid out of the front pocket. Printed on a home computer, little clip art shells in the corners. Across the top, in cheerful purple letters, it read Aunt Vanessa days, Tuesdays, Thursdays, alternating weekends, my name blocked into a calendar grid like a shift worker's, weeks and weeks of me, printed and laminated with a magnet on the back. I stood in my brother-in-law's hallway holding it and felt the floor of something give way. Then I checked the date printed small in the corner, the day the file was created. January. My mother hadn't mentioned any plan to me until March. They had printed my life 2 months before they bothered to inform me of it. The second proof found me in the cereal aisle. It was early April by then, and I was pushing a cart through the grocery store after a long day, when my Aunt Fran's neighbor Dolores came around the end cap and lit up like a porch light. She hugged me hard, rocked me side to side, and said right into my ear, "We are all just so proud of you." I asked what for, which was honest. She pulled back, beaming. "Diane told everyone at church you're taking a couple years off for the family, full-time, isn't that just the sweetest thing?" I stood there between the oatmeal and the granola bars while a near stranger squeezed my hands, and I did not correct her. I want to be honest about why. Standing in that aisle, I could already hear exactly how a correction would travel. Not as Dolores was mistaken. It would travel as Vanessa backed out. That week, 2 more people stopped me, both glowing, both blessing me for a decision I had never once made. My mother had gone out ahead of me into every room I might ever stand in, and told my story first. So I called her. I kept my voice level and said, "Mom, you can't tell people I'm quitting." "I told you no." And my mother said, warm as a heating pad, "Oh, honey, I was just so proud of you." Then, softer, with a little laugh that had no joke in it at all, "You'll see, it'll all feel natural once the baby comes." I hung up and sat very still. My mother had built me a cage out of compliments, and she wasn't finished building. I decided to tell them about Tasmania. Not the offer, which technically didn't exist yet, but the truth, the actual shape of my life. I rehearsed it for 3 days, in the shower, at red lights. A simple paragraph. I've applied for a fellowship overseas. I'm a finalist. My answer about the family plan is no, and it will stay no even if Tasmania says no. I drove to my parents on a Friday, got there early, helped with nothing on purpose, which took real effort, and the moment came. Plates cleared, my father reaching for the evening news, my mother pouring decaf, and I actually got the first sentence out. Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something about next year. My mother set the pot down and looked at me, and some animal part of her already seemed to smell it coming. And right then Renee called the house phone, shrieking. Piper had spiked a fever and had a short febrile seizure on the kitchen floor. Everything after that was coats and headlights. I was at their place in 9 minutes, because febrile seizures are terrifying and almost always harmless, and somebody in that hallway needed to be the person who actually knew that. I checked her over, talked Renee down off the ceiling, rode along to urgent care just in case. It was nearly midnight when we got back, Piper asleep on my shoulder heavy as a sandbag, and in Renee's kitchen my mother, who'd driven over to manage things, looked around at the wreckage and said to the room, in the voice of a closing argument, "You see, this is exactly why the plan makes sense. Some of us have families, Vanessa. Family takes care of family." Twice in 1 month, that same sentence, aimed at me like it was a fact of geology. Tell me something honestly in the comments. Have you ever rehearsed a sentence for days and life just kept snatching the microphone out of your hand right before you could use it? Type it if you know that feeling, and stay with me, because what my father did next hurt worse than anything my mother had said out loud. The following week, my landlord called me. Doug owns my building and half the bowling league trophies in town, a league that includes, among other retired gentlemen, my father. Doug's voice was all sunshine. Vanessa, your dad mentioned you'd be moving home in the fall, helping with the new grandbaby, wanted to check timing on the lease, whether you'd want out early. Real sweet of you, hon, they don't make daughters like that anymore. I stood in my kitchen looking at my own dark reflection and told him calmly that nothing was decided and I'd call him back. Then I drove to my parents' house, 40 minutes, most of it spent breathing on purpose, and found my father in the garage oiling something that clearly didn't need oiling. I asked him quietly if he'd really discussed ending my lease with my landlord before anyone had asked me a single question. My sweet, conflict-proof father rubbed the back of his neck, looked at his workbench, and said, "Well, your mother said it was decided." That sentence sat between us like a dropped wrench. Not we decided. Not even she decided. It was decided. Weather. Gravity. An act of God. I looked at this man who taught me to drive a boat before I could parallel park, and I understood he was never going to be the one to hand me my own future back. He was just the man who painted whatever room my mother pointed at. Meanwhile, the bill for all those rescues was landing on my actual career. Between the school pickup for Jonah and the night of Piper's seizure, I'd swapped 2 field days in 3 weeks, and April in a coastal restoration program is not a month with slack in it. Priya caught me by the boat launch, arms crossed, and being caught by Priya is like being caught by good weather, you don't notice it until she's serious. Nessa, you know I love you. Grant office flagged your absences. She lowered her voice. Hensley's team is finalizing that Tasmania fellowship any day now. You're the obvious pick on paper. But if you keep bleeding field days every time your family stubs a toe, somebody with worse instincts and better attendance gets the seat. I started to explain and she held up one hand, not unkind. I know it's not your fault. It's never your fault and it's always you. Then she said the sentence I've turned over 100 times since. They're spending your career like it's their gift card. I went back out on the water that afternoon and floated over the nursery frames, watching new coral catch light, and I thought about gift cards, about how there's a real number printed on them somewhere and everyone keeps swiping like there isn't, until one day the card just declines and everyone acts shocked. The offer arrived on a Thursday afternoon while I was rinsing gear on the dock. Not the group chat. Not my mother. An email, subject line starting with the exact words I'd been praying toward for 11 months. Offer of appointment. I didn't open it on the dock. I know how that sounds, but I'd waited 11 months, and some things you don't unwrap under fluorescent lights with salt still drying on your hands. I finished securing the boat, walked into the empty equipment shed, the one place on that whole property where I have always known exactly who I am, and opened the email from Dr. Hensley. Dear Ms. Cole, on behalf of the Institute, I am delighted to offer you appointment as Lead Field Research Fellow, Kelp Forest Restoration Program, Tasmania, a 2-year contract, salary listed in Australian dollars with a relocation allowance and settling in stipend, the Institute sponsoring my visa under the country's skilled research pathway. Start date, the first week of June, which meant flying by the end of May, which meant 12 weeks to dismantle a life and build a new one. I read it 3 times. My hands were shaking so hard the screen blurred, and I laughed at that. 13 years of steady hands on a dive line, trembling now like a first-year student's. I did not accept it that night. Instead, I did something I hadn't planned. I made a folder on my laptop just for this, the offer letter, the contract to be signed, the flight search page with a one-way ticket to Hobart already sitting in the cart. And when the cursor blinked in the box asking me to name the folder, I didn't type Tasmania or New Life. I typed 4 letters. Walt. My grandfather's name. Then I sat in that shed a while longer, listening to the tide against the pilings. All I had to do was sign. So why were my hands still shaking? I think you already know why. It had his name on it. And I still haven't told you what he gave me. Here's what my grandfather left me. The last truly clear night he had, about a month before the end, he sent me to his dresser for the cigar box where he kept old fishing lures and loose change, and made me dig out an old brass diving compass, the kind you clip to a wetsuit, its needle sluggish but still true, the leather strap gone soft as an old dollar bill. He pressed it into my palm with both his hands, which took him some doing by then, and told me a story I'd never once heard in 26 years. That before any of us, before my grandmother, before the marina, he'd been accepted into a marine survey program up in the Great Lakes Research Fleet, 19 years old, a whole different life on the water waiting for him. He never went. His mother needed him, then his younger brothers needed him, then a wife, then babies, then the babies' babies. I kept waiting for somebody to tell me it was my turn, he said, and his voice wasn't bitter, which was the worst part. It was just tired and certain, like a road sign. Nobody ever hands you your turn, Nessie. You take it. Then he tapped the compass with one knuckle and told me its needle had always run a few degrees off true, and he'd kept it that way on purpose, because every time he checked it, it reminded him that nothing hands you a straight line either. You correct for it yourself, every single time, or you drift. I wore that compass clip to my dive bag to his funeral, needle a few degrees off true, while the pastor praised my mother. I was holding it in the equipment shed 3 years later the night the offer came. So that's what I did, standing among the tanks and the spare fins. I looked at the compass. Then I opened the folder called Walt and signed the contract with a shaking hand, and bought the one-way ticket, and put the laptop away, and went back to work. My hands were still shaking. I signed anyway. That's the whole secret, if you want it. You don't wait for steady. You sign shaking. I meant to tell my parents that week. I had the offer letter printed and folded in my bag like a passport. My plan was simple, sit them down alone, calm, adult to adults. I drove over on a Saturday in May, rehearsed and ready, and my mother met me at the door with her eyes absolutely blazing with joy, grabbed my sleeve, and said, "Perfect timing, come see what your father did." She led me down to the basement. They'd cleared it out. The treadmill that held coats, gone. My father's fishing totes stacked in the garage. The paneling wore a fresh coat of pale blue paint, and against the far wall, made up with a quilt from my childhood bedroom, stood my old twin bed, my dresser from high school, a little lamp, new curtains hung over the window wells. My mother stood in the middle of it, arms spread, and said, "It'll be like having our girl home again," and her voice wobbled with real feeling. "That's the detail I need you to sit with. It was real. She wasn't performing. My father stood on the stairs behind us holding a paintbrush he hadn't needed for days, smiling, proud of the blue. They had built the cage lovingly. That's what I keep trying to explain to people since. It was a loving cage, with my own bed inside it. I stood there with the offer letter burning in my bag, and I understood, cold and clear as tap water, what would happen if I announced Tasmania right there, alone, with weeks of phone calls and church prayer chains available to be deployed against me before I ever reached an airport. My mother wanted an audience for my future. Fine. She'd get one. Before that dinner, I owe you my brother-in-law. Late in May, Chris showed up at my apartment to return a stock pot, which was an excuse, because Chris returns nothing. He stood in my doorway turning his cap around in his hands and said, "You don't have to do this whole thing, you know." And for one full second the hallway lit up. One ally, one person inside the fence who saw me. I opened my mouth to tell him everything, Tasmania, the contract, all of it. He beat me by half a breath. But Nessa, it would really save us. I mean it, Renee's drowning, daycare for 4 kids is more than I make in a month, and you, he shrugged, gesturing at my quiet apartment, my single coffee mug drying by the sink, you're free. Free. Sit with that word a minute, the way I have. He meant available. He also meant costless. In my family, those had always been the same word, and he didn't even hear himself say it, which is exactly how you know a belief has finished becoming furniture. I didn't tell him about Tasmania. I just said, I'm not free, Chris. I've never once been free. You've just never seen the bill. He blinked at me like I'd switched languages, thanked me for the stock pot, and left. My last maybe ally, folded before he ever unfolded. The summons went out the last week of May, delivered through the group chat with little wave emojis. Sunday, a family dinner to celebrate our newest blessing and settle the arrangements. My mother asked me to come at 3 to do the salmon, since yours is the one everybody likes. Of course she did. Before the dinner, I burned my boats quietly, thoroughly, and in person. Monday I called Doug myself before my father could do any more helping, and gave notice on my apartment for the end of the month. Tuesday, a man from an international relocation company walked my rooms, tagged the few pieces of furniture worth shipping, and quoted me a date. Wednesday I sat in the lab director's office and slid my resignation across the desk, 30 days notice by the book, my last field day scheduled and every box checked, because I was not going to let anyone say I left that nursery reef short-staffed on a whim. Thursday, Priya read the confirmation email over my shoulder in the stairwell, burst into tears, laughed at herself for crying, hugged me hard enough to leave a bruise, and said, Tasmania has no idea what's landing on them. By Sunday, there was no version of the future where I stayed. The lease was ended. The movers were booked. The resignation was filed. My grandfather's compass sat in my bag, needle steady a few degrees off true, keeping its own honest time. So when I walked into my mother's dining room that Sunday, I wasn't coming to ask permission. I was coming to deliver news. 14 plates on the table that night. 2 announcements coming. The one they'd planned for me, and the one riding in my coat pocket. Dinner rolled along on its rails, the salmon praised, the kids fed, my father telling his one story about the muskie that got away. Then at dessert my mother stood and tapped her glass with a spoon, and the table went quiet the way it always does for her. She'd prepared remarks. God gives every family exactly what it needs, she began, hand on her heart, and toasted Renee and Chris and the new little blessing due in the fall. Everyone raised their glasses, and it was genuinely lovely. I raised mine too. But she didn't sit back down. Instead she said, glowing, unfolding it like a homily, God also provides the help. Which brings us to the second announcement. She turned to me, arm out, presenting me to my own family like a prize behind a curtain. From May, our Vanessa will be stepping away from the lab and moving home. Your father did the basement, wait till you see it, to be this family's full-time support, all 3 kids and the new baby, one loving aunt. She actually got applause. Renee reached over and slid a spiral-bound packet closer to my plate, whispering that page 4 had the weekly grid. My father raised his glass at me, proud, already toasting. I set mine down. Mom, I said, and I kept it level and pleasant. We've talked about this. I have a career. The clapping trailed off, and my mother, still standing, still smiling, still warm as August, tilted her head at me with genuine, bottomless fondness and said it. Oh, sweetheart, you don't really have a life to interrupt, do you? No husband, no kids, that little apartment. This is us giving you one. Listen to me. Nobody flinched at the table. My father topped off the nearest glass like a man bailing a boat 1 teaspoon at a time. My whole family sat in perfect, comfortable agreement that my life was a vacant lot they'd finally found a good use for. I smiled. I actually smiled, because 3 weeks. That's why. I reached into my bag for my laptop, opened the folder named Walt, and turned the screen outward, setting it down gently in the middle of that table between the salmon platter and the ambrosia salad, like laying down a winning hand you're not even proud of. Before you laminate anything else, I said, you should see this. The contract filled the screen, the institute's crest at the top, the words Lead Field Research Fellow, my signature already dated 3 weeks back. I clicked once more, the flight confirmation, one way, from home to Hobart, 3 weeks from that very night. Nobody moved. 14 place settings, and not one sound except little Piper drumming her spoon against her tray, the only honest percussion in the house. I told them the rest in the same low, procedural voice I'd use logging dive data. I've accepted a 2-year fellowship in Tasmania, leading a restoration program I've worked 13 years toward. I've signed. I've given up my apartment. My last day at the lab was Friday. I fly in 3 weeks. I looked around the frozen table, then down at the spiral packet by my plate. The plan you printed has one problem. I was never yours to schedule. My mother's face did something I had never once seen it do in 35 years. It went from marble to water, right there over the good china. And she said the one thing in this world I had no armor against, soft, not shouted, worse. You would leave this family, she said, barely above the sound of the furnace, over a job. Then the room thawed all at once. Renee cried real tears, exhaustion has a sound and I know it, and asked how I could do this to the baby, a baby who did not yet exist and had somehow already outranked me. Chris sat working the edge of the tablecloth between 2 fingers, staring at my signature like it was a car crash. My father took off his glasses, cleaned them on his shirt, and said to no one in particular, Tasmania, that's an ocean and a half away, as if the problem were purely nautical. My mother cycled through her arsenal in front of me, one weapon at a time. First the little laugh, this is a phase, you'll come home by Christmas. Then the prosecutor, who applies for jobs overseas behind her family's back, sneaking around for a year like we're strangers. Then the pulpit, hand flat on the table, charity begins at home, Vanessa and it begins at home. I gave her the only thing I had left, which was brevity. It's signed, I said. It's paid. It's done. That's when my Aunt Fran, who hadn't said a full sentence since the Muskie story, set down her fork and said, Diane, let the girl talk. God bless Fran, because the next thing my mother tried wasn't louder, it was smarter, and it very nearly worked. She folded her napkin slowly, pressing each crease, and when she looked up her eyes had changed, the storm gone, something patient in its place, which scared me more than the shouting had. Nessie, she said, using the little girl name, the one from before everything. Sit down, baby, please. 1 year. That's all. Stay 1 year, till the baby's steady and Renee's back on her feet. Then you go to your Tasmania, and you go right, with our blessing. We'll throw you a proper send-off at the church. Your father will drive you to the airport himself, the whole family waving you off, proud of you. Don't leave us like this, in anger, with everything broken. Don't you want to leave the right way? I want to be honest with you about that moment, because this is the real heart of the story, not the laptop. Everything I had ever wanted from these people sat on that table, wrapped and ribboned, to be asked, to be thanked, to be blessed on my way out the door, waved at, missed. All I had to do was hand them 1 more year of my life, and I could buy the exact love I'd spent 15 years working toward, on credit, every eye on me at last. I stood there and actually felt myself begin to nod. Then I caught it. The flaw in the diamond, the thing my whole body already knew. A blessing you have to buy is not a blessing. It's an invoice with a bow on it. And there would always be 1 more year. The baby would need to be steady, and then Piper would need kindergarten, and then my mother's hip would finally go, and the machine would keep finding reasons, because reasons are what the machine is for. I knew it because a man in an equipment shed had once waited decades in somebody else's schedule for a thank you that never came, and called the waiting ordinary, and left me a compass instead of a straight line. No, I said. The word came out quiet and complete. My mother blinked. No, not in a year, not the right way, because Mom, there was never going to be a right way for me to leave, only a paid one. I picked my laptop up off the table, and Grandpa's compass caught the light through my open bag, and I heard my own voice come out steadier than it had any right to. And you were wrong about one thing tonight. I do have a real life. You've just never once asked to see it. Then I went around the table, because the clock on the rest of it had run out. I kissed Jonah's hair mid-protest. I hugged Piper, who hugs with her whole body even when she doesn't know why. I crouched at Lily's chair and told her, level with her eyes, a letter every month, a nurse's promise, except mine, a diver's promise. She nodded, businesslike, chin trembling, and pressed her thumb into the back of my hand like a stamp, because we'd read once that's how sailors used to seal a promise. I got my coat, and behind me my mother stood so fast her chair barked against the floor, her voice finally breaking open, and out came the oldest card in the deck. If you get on that plane, she said, shaking, don't you call this house your home anymore. The room made a sound all at once, like a breath going in. I stopped at the doorway 1 second, turned, and looked at my mother, furious, terrified, wet-eyed, dressed in her occasion earrings, the machine's best worker and its oldest casualty all at once. Then I'll write to the people in it who still call me family, I said. And I walked out my parents' front door into the cool May evening, and nobody followed me. That right there, that was the price. And I paid it in full. It was still the best trade I ever made. I sat in my car at the curb a while before I could drive. The dining room window glowed gold behind the curtains, shapes moving inside it, my whole family still in there, still around the salmon I'd made them. I cried once, hard, about 90 seconds, hands at 10 and 2 like I was steering through it. Grief, not regret, and yes, there's a difference. I finally learned it that night in my own body. You can be certain and heartbroken at the same time, both all the way. Then I wiped my face and looked at my grandfather's compass and did something I'd been meaning to do for 3 years. Nothing. I left the needle exactly where it sat, a few degrees off true, because I finally understood the point of it. It was never measuring a straight line. It was measuring the cost of waiting for permission. I flew 3 weeks later. Nobody from the house came to the airport, and I'd made my peace with that at the curb. Priya drove me, cried at security, and texted me a photo of my own plane taking off. Tasmania tested me first, cold rain sideways for 11 days straight, a flat I had to learn like a foreign language. Turns out when you've been needed every hour for 15 years, quiet feels like falling, at first. Then my first day on the water came, a boat full of researchers who stood up when I walked in, my name already on the project board, lead fellow, paid, printed, asked for. I lead restoration dives now that will outlast most of the people who ever doubted I had anything worth interrupting. News from home arrived in pieces, mostly through Chris, who started texting a few weeks in, short and sheepish, mostly photos. The baby came in October, a boy, healthy and loud. Renee hired part-time help 3 days a week, and the sky, somehow, held. It turned out we have no other option had only ever meant no other free option. My mother did not call. She told the church I'd abandoned the family in their hour of need, and some of them believed her. My Aunt Fran, I'm told, goes noticeably quiet whenever the subject comes up now, which for Fran is practically a protest march. And every month, like clockwork, a letter arrives from Lily, printed careful and hard, the letters getting steadier as the months go on. It's been a year now since that dinner. On weekend mornings after an early dive, I walk back along the harbor with coffee, and at noon my phone rings for the standing video call. Lily reads to me from library books off her own card. Jonah narrates whatever game he's conquering. Piper presses her eye right up against the camera because she thinks that's how you hug through a phone. Chris leans into frame most weeks now and says something about my accent. Once, from somewhere off camera, I heard Renee's voice, a little awkward, a little real, say thank you to your aunt. I had to look out at the water for a second after that one. My father sends postcards, of all things. The last one had a lighthouse on it, and underneath, in his careful mechanic's print, proud of you, don't tell your mother. I laughed until I wasn't laughing anymore, because no, my mother hasn't called. Maybe she never will. And here's the change I can honestly report from the far side of the world. I can live with that. Not happily. Honestly. There's a difference there too. The machine still runs back in that house, and it still tells its version of the story at church. But it runs without me now. My grandfather's compass sits on my wrist right now, needle a few degrees off true, in the middle of a life that finally runs on its own bearing. If you take one thing from my story, take this. A family that only loves you for what you carry will call it love right up until the day you finally set the weight down. And the people worth keeping are the ones who help you set it down. That's the whole lesson. It cost me a blessing I never actually needed, and it bought me a life I actually live. A fourth baby, a printed schedule, a basement with my old bed still made up in it, and one laptop set face up on my mother's table. If anyone has ever told you that you don't really have a life to interrupt, hear me, from a harbor 12,000 miles past that dining room. You do. It's just waiting on you to sign it. If this story found you on a night you needed it, subscribe to Hidden Chapters and share it with the friend who's still holding everyone else's weight, and tell me in the comments, because I read every one of them with my coffee by the water, what's your one-way ticket?